All right, let's get started. Um, this is SIG architecture meeting for December 12th, 2024. I think this will be our last one of the year, most likely. We have a couple agenda items. Let me share that screen. All right. Tim, I know you only have a short time. I see you're here, so why don't you jump right in with the first one?
Sorry, stepped away to grab a Coke at the wrong moment. Um, so I appreciate jumping to the front, or people tolerating me pushing myself to the front. Um, this topic came up in a sort of unexpected way. The long story short, we have an early Kubernetes. We had this volume plugin idea. One of the models that was proposed as a plugin was, hey, what if we sync from a Git repo? Wouldn't that be cool as a volume? And so basically it just runs git clone into an empty dir and gives you that as a volume, which is great. And then we realized, wow, that's actually totally not sufficient at all. This project that I run in my free time called Git Sync, which was spawned from that idea, was like, here's a better way to do it as a sidecar. Um, and I've been sort of maintaining that for a few years now, and it works. The question then is the Git repo volume still useful? And now the revelation that actually there's this massive security problem where in your Git repo, you can define a hook which runs in the kubelets context. And is that okay? Clearly, it's not a good security position to be in. What do we do about it? The proposal was, hey, let's just nullify the Git repo volume entirely. It's a terrible thing. Nobody should be using it. We should get rid of it. Obviously, we're not. I don't think anybody's proposing a breaking API change like we would get rid of the fields, but they are proposing make it do nothing, which is still a breaking change, though less of a breaking change. I don't have data that says nobody is using it or that says lots of people are using it. Anecdotally, I've never seen anybody who's actually using it to good effect. Like, but probably somebody is. It's there. It's in the documentation. It's in the API definition. So the question here is, what is we? I don't know of any or not very many places where we've ever done a breaking change, even for security reasons. So I was looking for how many precedents do we have here, and does that set enough precedent for this to justify the nullification of that functionality? Or do we do something more creative, like SIG Storage is suggesting, treat it more like a CSI conversion where you can swap it out for the other Git sync sidecar, which runs inside the pod context sort of transparently. And would that be a breaking change? Like, actually, I mean, it would. If somebody was using this hooks functionality to good effect, we would break them, potentially.
It also changes the resource profile of the pod.
Also changes the resource profile of the pod. It would add a sidecar container to pods that maybe didn't have one before. Going from 1 to 2 containers in a pod could confuse a whole lot of automation. Like, there's a lot of risk to that too.
Well, I don't see any hands, so I'll render an opinion. I read through the issue earlier, and my opinion would be, I think, probably aligned with what I think Jordan was saying. Like, let's start with a um, off by default feature gate that would disable it, that would neuter it, and then we run that through our policy, eventually making that on by default, and then um, never remove the API fields, but we can remove the code once we graduate that, providing people the migration path through GitSync. That's my
So
opinion.
we do have a written deprecation policy that lets us do this. I really truly do not know how many times we've used that. We've tried really hard not to break anybody for any reason, even if we made a bad decision in the past. To Antonio's question in the chat, and then I'll hand over to David with the hand. Yes, it's been marked as deprecated since like 1.11 or something, like forever. If you create a pod that says use a git repo volume, you will get back a yellow warning from kubectl that says, warning, git repo has been deprecated. It doesn't say, warning, git repo is a massive security hole that you should avoid, but it does say it's deprecated. David had a hand first.
Yeah. So I'm trying to remember back. We had an issue with networking and being able to directly control endpoints, maybe, where we actually added some sort of a rule to prevent a subset of things from being specified.
Yes,
Um,
that's right.
and so that was certainly breaking. Now that API had some good uses for it. I'm trying to remember whether we added that as an admission plugin or whether we added that at a REST handler layer.
It,
And
it's actually an well, okay, there's been a couple of things, but I think the one you're referring to was a change in RBAC. We changed the default RBAC for namespace owner to not include endpoints. It used to include endpoints. For new clusters, it will not include endpoints. And so anybody who has a cluster and it's working already, we didn't break them in situ, but for new clusters, they would break. Is that the one you're remembering?
I didn't think so, but I also, Jordan, do you remember?
I remember a few.
Oh yes, there was also the external IP one. Whoever just
There
posted
was
that.
one that I was thinking we did as an admission plugin.
It was just posted in the chat. Yes.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So when we did that, that gives us some flexibility, right, with feature gates and what's in a default admission chain, while still, even after it's complete, allowing someone to specify, no, really, I want to use this. So the functionality would remain there, but would become unavailable in most cases.
So the problem that I've had with that one is it requires cluster providers like OpenShift or GKE or EKS to make a decision or to pass that decision up through their control API to let the user make a decision whether to activate that admission controller. We have VAP now. VAP is a fairly straightforward way to achieve this effect. I posted somewhere in the thread a VAP that just says, look, you can't use this plugin. If your pod uses this plugin, I'm just going to fail you on admission. That lets a cluster admin make a decision whether it's a whole cluster or some namespaces within the cluster, or to change which resources it applies to, and they don't need providers to make a control API change. In my opinion, that is sort of superior in every way.
That
But
also
I jumped the
seems like
line
it
on
would
Jordan.
leave the decision at the level where you would expect. It's not the distribution's decision. It is the decision of someone who already has the rights to take action as they see fit on every kubelet. So I can see
Right,
that.
but it is insecure by default, which is the price of compatibility.
Yeah. You asked if we've ever made breaking changes for security reasons. The oldest one I can remember is when we made atomic volumes read only, and that broke a lot of stuff. That was very early in Cube. So we were pretty cavalier about that. There was no way to opt out of that. We didn't have, I don't even know that we had feature gates back then. It was just like, well, there's a security hole. We closed the hole. You're welcome. Those are all read only now. And we found a lot of things that broke as a result. I am a fan of improving defaults with escape hatches. So the mechanism I'm not as attached to, whether it's admission or a gate or something like that. There's prior art for disabling specific volume plugins when we were doing the cloud provider migration. So we had gates around every provider and you could spin up a cluster in GCP and say, turn off the AWS and the AKS volume plugins because you can't use them here and we just don't want that code active. And then the other cloud providers could do the same thing. So there's prior art for putting a gate around this if a deployer wants to just make their deployments secure by default. They say, we don't care about this. We want it off. We don't want to make everybody install a VAP. We just want this off. I would probably start there. That should be non-contentious and give people who want to turn this off a way to do it while we explore, like, do we want to give a migration path or I don't know. I don't know what else we want to do.
Do you think the VAP is sufficient for that?
I don't love insecure by default, and you have to know about this and tack on some object into your cluster to close a hole. I don't love that.
I completely agree with that, but that is the compatible answer. Anything short of that is a breaking change. Now we're just talking about degrees, right? The simplest degree, let me throw out an option that I think we overlooked. I mean, we talked about, but not much. We could change the Git repo volume to just not do hooks, right? That will patch this specific security hole. It will only break people for whom they were using hooks. And you know, it will, if you were using Git repo without hooks, you'll still be fine. But we would, you know, the degree of breaking is less.
I think we should definitely do that.
If we're going to rip the whole thing out, then.
Well, yeah.
So Jordan, what you had talked about adding a like default one way or another, but then having a flag to control this or something on the CLI, doesn't that hit the same problem that Tim was talking about, where the decision has to either be bubbled up via a cloud provider or vendor to be able to set it? It was the same issue I think Tim raised with my suggestion. Doesn't bother me per se, but it doesn't resolve that issue that Tim had, right?
Being able to make that decision at the cluster level, but as the cluster provider, I guess.
Yeah, so in the case where, like Tim said, hey, David, yes, we could do that, but to do that, we would have to expose an option in GKE to turn it on and an option in OpenShift to turn it on or off. Or
if the data shows that people are actually using it. Like I haven't actually looked at the data yet, so I don't know. I don't think providers are obligated to make even unsafe things available. Sometimes it's necessary because a lot of people depend on it and it would be too much of a breaking change. Sometimes if it has negligible use and huge downsides, providers can say, nope, we
I'm
don't.
not going to speak for Tim's concern there, but I just want to be sure we see like it's the same concern.
I think giving the power on a per cluster basis with opt-in or opt-out, however, whichever direction we want to make it, is reasonable in the absence of good data about use.
So if I understand VAP correctly, there's no way to express a categorical yes, just a categorical no, right? I can't say, even if any other admission controller says no, still yes.
Yeah, admission only denies, and
right.
all must agree that it's allowed.
Right. So if we make it a default on and GKE doesn't offer it as an API, there is no recourse for an end user, right?
At that point, yeah.
Except to lobby GKE or OpenShift or whomever to go and add that as a control option. Yeah. I mean, I'm okay with it. My suspicion is the usage is really, really low, and everybody who's using it would be better with a different solution anyway.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that a provider should only do with lots of good data. And so before, I mean, this is all hypothetical, but before we went and did something like that, we would look at the whole fleet and see what the use was. And probably if it was a big number of customers, we probably were like, oh, we can't do that. Now we're into like documentation or warning or something. I don't know. Try to make it safe without breaking compatibility. If it's a tiny number of users, then it's like, well, maybe do customer outreach and see like,
Yeah.
what's your use cases? Can we burn those down to something better and safer? And then with sufficient warning and advance notice, like after this version, this is off. Like with the benefit of data, I think
Yeah.
we can actually make decisions like that. But sitting here, we don't have that data. So now I'm like, what
So-
levers can we give?
So if we did something like an admission control that was opt-in, then we're still insecure by default, and everybody who's upgrading their clusters has to go and read the release notes and add this new admission controller, like the deny external IPs one. How efficacious was that really? How many people actually run that admission controller if we don't set it by default? Or we set it by default and we put it in the release notes and we say, we're going to break some people. And as a cluster provider, you have to make a decision to remove it from the default list.
Well, can we gather some data before? I mean, this isn't going to happen. I guess theoretically, if it's a bad enough security thing, we could do it in a patch release. But most likely, I was thinking this is a
It'll be
130.
33.
So we have time to gather some data. If we find that it's like 0.00001% of the fleet, like then that's an easier calculation.
Yeah.
But if it,
Um,
but we couldn't
we
make
could
the
al-
decision in Kubernetes based on the GKE fleet.
I was actually going to ask, you going to publish those
Yeah.
numbers? Yeah,
I mean,
I can't publish mine. So
if the number was 0, maybe.
oh, okay, that's fair. If the number was 0, I could probably publish 0.
Or I mean, if the number was, less than 1/100th of 1%, effectively 0, probably. But if it was
I'm not
42,
sure.
I don't think the answer would be. I don't know. I'd have to get clearance on that. We can also talk about degrees here. What if the admission controller was disable hooks in Git repo volume? And if you need hooks, then you have to go figure out. We can't, the data that we could get from the fleet would not give us that information because you only know that by looking at the Git repo. But the users would complain and each provider could make their own decision. Is a clean break better or worse here?
I would like to see us do both. Default the hooks off with an escape hatch and have a way to turn the whole thing off. I could see leaving that on. You can opt into that, but like we know there's a hole today, so let's close the hole with an escape hatch. And then we suspect there are lots of other possible holes in the future. So let's give a way for people who don't want to mess with any of this and know their own usage to just skip the whole thing.
I'm less sold on the second part. I mean, we're removing a function, a feature because it had one security vulnerability in 10 years. That doesn't feel right. It's a bad one, but it was one vulnerability.
I'll defer to people who understand that surface area better than I do.
I have to run, actually. I have to run back to my other meeting. I'm happy to pursue, I'm happy to send a pull request that disables hooks and offers some way to re-enable hooks. I don't know the right mechanism for that, so I'll have to think hard about whether it's a kubelet config or something else. I don't want to put API surface for it in, but maybe that's the only way.
If we think we're going to be able to eventually remove it completely, it could be a gate, feature gate.
I would start with the gate in the kubelet.
Yeah.
I mean, all right, I'll have to think and do it. My time is going to be limited for this release cycle, so if anybody's particularly interested in helping out here, I'd be willing to share the credit for this one. But I wanted to bring it out here. I appreciate all the input, but I have to drop off now.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks all.
Okay, going back to our agenda, which let's see, I think we have one other item on the agenda here. All right. Sorry, I don't know who that is. Dimitri?
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
Yes. So, yeah, I would like to discuss this proposal. I don't know if you guys have a chance to look at it. I was trying to send information about that prior to this meeting, so I sent email, and we also discussed it in a SIG network meeting 2 weeks or a week ago. Yes. So how should I proceed? Do I need to share my screen and present this cap, or
I think that's probably a
describe?
good idea. Whatever you want to share your screen or just describe it. Like I, I, I read through some of it myself, but there's a lot of people on the call, and
Yeah.
not all of them.
So okay. So yes. So I'm software engineer from NVIDIA, and we are working on enabling large training jobs in big clusters, and we realized that some of the workloads are not very efficient because of the way Kubernetes places the job pods on the nodes, and that gave us a kind of idea to make it more kind of make it more efficient. And we discussed it during the last KubeCon. We discussed it between ourselves and also talked to almost all cloud service providers who were present at KubeCon. And at least during KubeCon, we got positive feedback, and so we posted this cap. So this idea had several iterations, but bottom line is that we are proposing to create node labels based on network topology of the cluster, and we can reconstruct cluster network topology from APIs that CSP already provides today. So we have means to do that in Google, in GCP, AWS, and OCI. We can also reconstruct network topology on certain on-prem clusters if switch network switch vendor provides this functionality. So the kind of goal of this proposal is to create some set of standard labels that would be applied on the nodes, and this could be used by future or existing schedulers. For example, it could be used today in pod affinity by specifying a topology key. And we are also working on developing Kubernetes native podgang scheduler plugin that will also leverage these labels. I saw somebody raised a hand. Antonio? Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to give some context because I was talking with Dimitri and other people internally too. So the same way that cloud providers ended having region and zones for network traffic, now there is a pattern with these new training workloads that there is a kind of fourth-tier architecture that seems to cloud providers are aligning on that. And what Dimitri is proposing here is the same kind of normalization that was done with region and zone he's proposing this. I think that now is 4 tiers, right? Accelerators, whatever. And that will provide normalization across the ecosystem, so the tools and the schedulers for trainings can use these common labels for implementing this algorithm. The whole proposal is only sustainable if normalized, right? So it's important the alignment that all the cloud providers or all the people that expose infra uh, have the same meaning for the same label. Dimitri, I think that kind of summarized this correctly.
Yes, thank you.
David?
Yeah, one of the things that I noticed about this, like I can appreciate the goal of normalization and when there is broad agreement and stability in the thing being suggested, I can see that it makes sense. But knowing how varied network configurations are, and knowing that even in this proposal, the proposal itself seeks to add a thing that we would have gotten wrong. If we'd made this a year ago, we would have been wrong. It's not clear to me whether it's really standardization or just pinning to a particular instant. And then pinning doesn't immediately seem like a clear benefit.
I don't see. I would say really briefly, I don't see Dan Winship in this call, but he has a pretty interesting comment along those lines that I don't see a response to yet.
I actually am here, and I wrote that like half an hour before the meeting, so I was not expecting a response.
Right, I thought it might be worth discussing. Let me link to that.
Is it about the array?
No, this is about, I think it's the same thing David said, and I'm leaning this way too, is that network architectures and topologies vary considerably. It sounds like this is, right, NVIDIA has a particular recommended network architecture when trying to do these large training jobs. And so if we're going to standardize something at the Kubernetes level, it becomes challenging if a lot of clusters don't fit well into that architecture. From a tooling perspective, I wonder if it's just as useful if this is primarily for NVIDIA recommended architecture, that these become NVIDIA standardized labels rather than Kubernetes standardized labels. And the tooling, given the strength of NVIDIA in the market, the tooling will interpret those, I'm sure, quite happily. So I mean, I'm not making I'm not.
Just to address that, it's actually not NVIDIA. So we are using CSP API to reconstruct cluster topology. It's a completely like AWS and GCP and OCI. They have API that allows us to reconstruct hierarchy of network, and it's not it's not necessarily a physical switches. It's a kind of virtual. It's a collection of switches that CSP identifies as a logical unit, and they all located on different kind of levels. So, and also, I think it's pretty common that every data center has racks and servers in these racks. So that's what we identify as a block, and then the racks are connected between themselves. So it's a spine, and then there is a data center where all the racks are. So it's a pretty standard, at least for today, in how data centers are built. So it's nothing specific to NVIDIA at all. The only
Okay.
thing that we are using here is, yes, so when you have a rack, then nodes, servers in the rack could be interconnected using very fast specific switches, which we called accelerator, but it's just a name. We can change the name if that's a problem. But other than that, it's a pretty standard way of, at least in today's technology.
Right, in today's technology, spine leaf and all that.
I wouldn't discount Dan's feedback there that says, it might be common in a cloud provider, but there are other use cases that appear to be missing.
Yeah, it seems like this is really, really focused on the AI whatever case, and I'm sure there are a lot of people doing that, but I don't know, maybe it just makes more sense as coming up with a set of standard labels that AI workloads use rather than a Kubernetes wide standard for network topology where it doesn't really seem to cover all use cases.
I guess the question would be like, what happens if those aren't populated? How does the tooling behave? What sort of decisions get made incorrectly? Right? If you're in an environment where you can't populate those labels because they don't make sense, do we expect that tooling to work? Are we creating a loose abstraction that's kind of like going to lead to confusion? I mean, there are other things, right? In an on-prem environment, you don't have to populate other topology things, right? You don't have to populate region and zone, and they wouldn't necessarily have meaning in a lot of environments. I don't know.
John, that's basically like Dan's comment that I linked.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to back up a second, like, do we have prior art? What are, other than the region and zone, like, what are our rules? I haven't looked at them in years. Like, what are our rules around adding these kind of names and labels? In general, we've been a little bit wary of being too prescriptive in things. So I don't know. We probably have to look at prior art and then think about the consequences and think about the alternative solutions, right? Like, there's no reason why we can't define them outside the scope of the Kubernetes project as well.
I think the other part was that again, that like Dan brought up already in the comments, was that if the use case is I want to schedule things close to each other, then maybe it makes more sense to have a way to describe that and leave it up to some controller to be responsible for that specific to the cloud or environment, versus saying I'm going to have a standard model of the layout and then something else is going to key off of that and try to accomplish scheduling close, versus just having the workload say I want to be scheduled co-located with like DRA or something, and then the scheduler provided by the cluster should take that into account, and with domain specific awareness of what does close actually mean in that cluster.
I mean, in some sense, what Dimitri's suggesting does that, because, right, it defines a schema, and I assume it's a tree-like structure. So it's a hierarchy, and so there's different levels of closeness, and it's a cluster specific or cloud provider specific, at least, controller that populates those labels, and so it can determine those logical units however it wants. It's just that the names tend to evoke, a mental model that might not be accurate, but I mean, that's not necessarily the end of the world. Well, what happens when there's another level? Like, accelerator isn't really a tree structure, right? Because you could have an accelerator network presumably that spans racks, for example. Like, if you,
Yes.
right? So it's orthogonal to the others.
Yes. Correct.
Yeah. So which labels let us do. We don't imply, but I don't know. The mental model gets a little confusing for customers, I think, at that point. And tomorrow's technology, where does it land? And we add a new label, I guess.
Yeah, we add a new label, but then we have a bunch of tooling stuck in an old pattern, then we don't know which is old and which is new. It's not a trivial thing to do, which is why the point, and I can see Dan also brought up this one, the point of like, well, we already would have gotten this wrong if we'd done it a year ago, and would have been trying to teach an entire ecosystem about something new. Finding a better solution, finding a solution that doesn't box us in that way sounds like an improvement.
Yeah, but a year ago we didn't have. I mean, to the point, technology advances. Like a year ago, we didn't have like cluster with thousands of nodes.
We did, but it also it bumps exactly into the point, right? Of I have no reason to believe we are more accurate now for future us than we would have been, past us would have been for us here. And the consequences of adding a 4-level hierarchy to which you then have to train an ecosystem to add the 5th and the 6th, or potentially peer to, it's not an immediate and obvious slam dunk.
Okay, any other questions? We have Dimitri here to have this discussion. I mean, it sounds like there's uncertainty, is the way I would put it. We can certainly continue the discussion, Dimitri, but since we're all here, we still technically have 20 minutes. Like, anybody have any questions on how this would work, or other concerns Dimitri may be able to address?
Do you see a use case besides I want to have things with low latency to each other?
So I see two major use cases. One is big training AI workload that spans multiple nodes, and another another use case is when we have multiple services that require intensive data exchange, and we want to place them again in network proximity. So that's the second use case. What we are working on in parallel is we are working on gang scheduler plugin that will use those labels. So hence this proposal to kind of be a stepping stone towards that. But obviously it will work without the standard. The rationale behind this cap is that, for example, AWS already generates this not labels, but they obviously have different names. And since other CSPs, they provide this API, it's just I think matter of time that they will label the nodes accordingly. And so the goal was to have some standard way of labeling the nodes, so people, so users could migrate workloads between different Kubernetes environments without changing them.
Right. You're saying this is going to evolve anyway, and we're just going to have a mess if everybody has their own names, and then we lose some of the workload portability across clouds if we don't have common names for these. I think the concern that's being raised is that even in, that the meaning of those or the structure of those may be unstable, and that trying to create a standardized wording now when they're fairly unstable could cause regrets later. I think that's the main concern.
Okay. Yeah, I guess we can keep this discussion offline. I will try to address the comments.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, we don't have more definitive action for you, but sometimes these things take a while for people to sort out. And I
No,
think that
understood.
that specifically, since it's kind of a judgment call of like, what's the level of stability here? We may just need to let this evolve and let some mess evolve and then clean up the mess. I'm not sure. We'll see. But any other comments before we go, or we get 15 minutes, folks? I think that's our last agenda item. All right. In that case, our next meeting would be the 26th. I think that it's likely that will be canceled. So probably see you all next year. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Sure.